So it is my great pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker this morning, Dr. Geeta Gopinath, who will be speaking on her paper entitled The International Price System, which was first presented this past August at the U.S. Federal Reserve Jackson Hole Symposium. Dr. Gopinath has been a professor of economics at Harvard University since 2005 and is currently the John Swanstro Professor of International Studies and Economics. Her research focuses on international finance and macroeconomics. She's also a visiting scholar at the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, a managing editor of the Review of Economic Studies, co-editor of the Current Handbook of International Economics, a research program member at the International Growth Center at the London School of Economics and Oxford University, and a research associate with the National Bureau of Economic Research for the NBER programs in international finance and macroeconomics, monetary policy, economic fluctuations, and growth. In 2013-14, Dr. Gopinath served as a member of the Eminent Persons Advisory Group on G20 matters for India's Ministry of Finance. Before coming to Harvard, she was an assistant professor of economics at the University of Chicago's Graduate School of Business, and she received her PhD in economics from Princeton University in 2001. Very busy for the past 15 years. Geeta has also served as a BLS visiting researcher, focusing on IPP microdata. In fact, Dr. Gopinath's most recent use of IPP data was as a major input for the work on the paper that she'll be discussing this morning. We are very glad to have you with us this morning, so please join me in welcoming Dr. Gopinath.
Good morning. Thank you so much for this invitation. I have spent many hours and days at the BLS, so I feel like this is a bit of my second home after Harvard, and so it's always great to be back. I want to thank Susan Black for inviting me to give this talk. This is a great opportunity for two reasons. One, to firstly thank everybody who's helped me work with this data over the years. And second, to share with you what I think are some of the great insights that have come out of having this very high quality of data that gets collected by the International Price Program at the BLS. So let me just quickly thank a few people before I get started. There are many more people who helped me and who I should be thanking, and I would like to thank more generally, but let me just give you a few names. So I started out here as a visiting scholar in 2005. And when at that point, Bill Alterman, who was the head of IPP, was extremely helpful in getting access to the data. I believe I was one of the first researchers who worked with the IPP data, so this was a kind of a new use of BLS data, and so this was great that that I was given access to it. I want to thank Janet Siegel, who's helped me a lot who's kind of appreciated my proposals and helped them go through with approval. I'd like to thank Darrell Slusher, who helped me many times with the data, including calling him at his home when he was on his cell phone in a panicked state, saying that something wasn't right. And he was always there and could fix it very quickly. He always had some magic button that made things work. I want to thank Rosie Ulix, who's been my project coordinator. I don't see her. Where is she?
Over here.
Oh, there she is, yes. So Rosie's been with me for 10 years. I still remember the very first day I came through the entrance of the BLS, and I saw Rosie, and I said, well, this is going to be the start of a beautiful friendship. And you're right, and we've been great friends. Marshall Blackman and the WC Tech people for all their help whenever we had issues with the computers. And more recently, when I came in very recently, I worked very closely with Mubarak Ahak, who was absolutely terrific and it was a pleasure to work with. So everybody here at the BLS has been fantastic. I mean, people say that when the government doesn't function as efficiently as other sectors do. I really question that whenever I come here. It's been great. I've had a really fantastic experience working with the data, working with the people, and really no complaints. So that said, let me get into my talk that I wrote. It's a paper I wrote for the Jackson Hole Symposium. Oh, thank you for the very kind introduction. And I want my first slide. I don't want this slide. If I go back.
It's my fault.
Okay. Okay, that's great. This works. All right. Okay. So, so as you know, the Jackson Hole Symposium happens every year. It is a major central bankers conference held by the the Kansas City Fed. And there's always a theme to the conference. So the conference always has one core topic. And the topic this past summer was inflation. It's clearly a very important topic for monetary policy makers. And there's been clearly a lot of surprise and maybe puzzles about why inflation hasn't reacted the way it should have. Some would argue that it should have been higher. Some would argue that it should have been lower than what it is. But when a central bank that has in its mandate a target of meeting an inflation rate of about 2% consistently misses it for 3 years in a row, there's certainly good reason to pause and wonder, what's going wrong in the approach to in our understanding of inflation. So the symposium was about inflation, and my role as an international economist was to speak to the international dimension of inflation. Now there are many aspects to it. You can think of the most simplest thing, which is about commodity prices and the fact that commodity prices, when they're rising, that's inflationary. When they're falling, that's disinflationary or deflationary. But the one that for me is probably more interesting and something we need to understand better is the relationship between prices and exchange rates. And so I've been working on this for the last 10 years, and whatever insights I came up with really came out of working with IPP data. So as I go through this, I'm going to stop and tell you where is it that I kind of got some interesting ideas from. But it was really based on my understanding of working with U.S. international price data. Okay, so why do we think that this is important to understand the link between prices and exchange rates? The way I think about it is that if you look at any kind of international discussion about spillovers of monetary policy across countries, about how countries are interlinked, the variable that comes up all the time is a country's exchange rate, right? Now, the exchange rate is a relative price of a country's currency. And because it's relative, by construction, it depends not just on what the country does, but it also depends on what the rest of the world is doing. So it's a direct source of generating interconnectedness across countries. And when policymakers think about exchange rates, they care about the relationship between exchange rates and inflation. And they care about the relationship between exchange rates and a country's trade balance. Right. So the reason when I was thinking about what to write for the Jackson Hole Symposium, I was motivated by the fact that when I would hear Janet Yellen speak about the dollar, or I would hear Raghuram Rajan, who is the head of the Reserve Bank of India, the equivalent of the Federal Reserve here, they would say pretty much the same thing in terms of the link between the exchange rate and prices. Okay, so I'm not sure if the mic is working at all, but it's working. Okay.
Both of them.
So they would say a very similar thing. So I would read a speech with Janet Yellen, and Janet Yellen would be saying, because the dollar has appreciated, we, that has put, that has had disinflationary consequences for the U.S. economy, is part of the reason why the U.S. economy is missing its inflation target. So there was this period between mid-2014 and the first half of 2015 when the dollar had appreciated by about 15%. And so that was considered to have this effect on inflation. And where does that thinking come from? There's a basic thinking behind it, which is the fact that there's a sense that there is a price at which, let's look at the price of goods coming into the U.S. from Japan. So the idea is that, okay, there is a yen price of the good that's been sold by the Japanese producer to the U.S. economy. And that yen-Japanese price doesn't move very much. So it's a kind of a sticky price, right? And so then just mechanically, when the dollar appreciates, the dollar price of that good that's being imported from Japan falls. It's mechanically. And the other way around. If the dollar is depreciating, which means that the dollar is losing value relative to the yen, then since the yen price of that particular good is not changing by assumption, when the dollar depreciates relative to yen, that's going to make the Japanese product more expensive in US markets, and that's going to have an inflationary effect. So that's what I would call as the first piece of the so-called consensus policy view. And Janet Yellen would say that, and Raghuram Rajan, who's the head of an emerging market central bank, would say the same thing. He would say, well, the rupee is depreciating relative to the dollar, and that's having an inflationary effect on the Indian economy. The second piece of that consensus view is what goes along with this, which is the fact that when a country's exchange rate depreciates, it's good for its competitiveness in world markets. It's good for its trade balance, which is the difference between its exports and imports. And why is that? Again, it comes down to the same idea, which is the fact that, think of a US exporter. The US exporter's dollar price, for some reason, is assumed not to change. And then suppose that the dollar depreciates on the world market, which means that it loses value relative to other world currencies. That's going to make the dollar product cheaper on world markets. And so that's going to increase demand for US products, and that's going to be expansionary on the export side. On the flip side, on the import side, the Japanese products price in yen hasn't moved. When the dollar is depreciating relative to the yen, that means it's going to make the yen product more expensive in US markets. So that's going to reduce the demand for US products. And so we should expect that when the dollar is weaker, exports go up, imports go down, and that's an expansion that's an increase in demand for the US economy. That's an improvement in the US economy's trade balance. So depreciations would be considered to be good. It would be what is expansionary. Appreciations, on the other hand, which the US economy had, is bad because it's going to shift demand away from US goods towards the rest of the world, and that's a problem. So this is what I describe as a consensus view. It didn't matter which central banker you were, you kind of all said the same thing, that this would be the effect. Now, obviously, all these consensus views come from some sound, some wisdom. There is a reason why this has turned out to be the consensus view. And the reason it has is because there's a long list of famous economists, including Nobel laureates, who pushed this view of the world, which is, so it goes back to Fleming, Mandel, Dornbusch. These are the kind of the foundational principles of international macroeconomics, and it goes back to them. Mandel is one of the people who won the Nobel Prize. And so this was the view that they pushed. Okay? So the crucial assumption here in backing this worldview is the fact that, is what I said earlier, which is that prices are rather sticky or rather rigid in the currency of the producing country. So the price that's not moving around much is if it's the US selling some product, the US dollar price is not moving much. If you have a Japanese producer selling a product, the Japanese yen price is not moving very much. So if you assume that that's the way the world is, then indeed that this is exactly what you should expect to see. And the second thing that consistent with that is that you should expect a whole lot of symmetry, which means it is indeed the case. It makes perfect sense for both Janet Yellen and for Raghuram Rajan to have the exact same view about these exchange rate movements, because there's a great deal of symmetry to this. This is also behind all of the discussion about global currency wars. Is this particular worldview that when a country's currency depreciates, it's good for the economy because it shifts demand towards its product. So when people talk about currency wars, it's basically about the accusation that countries are willfully manipulating their exchange rate. China is depreciating its exchange rate because it wants to shift demand towards its own products away from the others. So that is behind this thinking about, in the international space, in the international trade architecture, there is this sense in which countries can benefit at the expense of other countries by weakening their currency relative to somebody else. Because again, this is a relative price. When if you win, somebody else has to lose, and that's why it's considered a war. Again, so this is the reason. I mean, it's very important for us to understand exactly the link between exchange rates and prices, because it speaks to all these issues, including to, currency wars, which is something that's gone back decades, many decades, when every 20, 30 years countries come together and decide whether they need to have an agreement and agree not to compete with each other and not engage in competitive devaluations. Okay, so I've listed here my publications from using BLS IPP data. As you can see, I've made a career out of it. But this is basically what came out of spending, not all the last 10 years, but very important of those 10 years working with BLS IPP data. And when I started writing this Jackson Hole Symposium, my view was to basically hit at this so-called consensus view, was to say that this consensus view is missing something very, very important. It is not the case that prices are sticky in the producer's currency. It is not the case that there's a huge amount of symmetry in the world, that everybody gets affected by their exchange rates appreciating and depreciating the same way. And so maybe you want to step back and think about what's the impact of purposefully manipulating your currency. You have a notion that it benefits your economy in a particular way, but it's not what you think it is. And so that's basically where I came to. That was the kind of the hypothesis I was putting out there. Now, I had worked a lot with U.S. data, and so I was extrapolating from the U.S. data to the rest of the world, which is obviously, it doesn't have to be true. But the richness of the IPP data helped me think through what the implications for other countries in the world, and that's how I was able to extrapolate to many other countries. And in fact, it turned out that the results were indeed as one might expect if you took the U.S. Data seriously. Okay, so what I did was I defined what I call the international price system. When I was thinking of this title, I was thinking, well, we have something called the international monetary system. But there is something quite systematic to how prices get set in international markets, so I call this the international price system. I don't have a watch, I should keep control of the time. And I should also please interrupt me and ask questions whenever you choose to. I'm very used to that, as you can imagine, if you permit. So feel free at any point in time to ask questions. Okay, so I define what I call the international price system, which is basically to say that there are which I defined with two pieces. So there was two characteristics or two features of what I call the international price system. The first is the fact that there's a dominance of dollar invoicing in world trade. So this is not the case that prices are sticky in the currency of the producing country, but on the contrary, prices are sticky in dollars. And I'll show you how widespread this phenomenon is. I wasn't the first person to point that out. The dollar invoicing is a big deal. But I think the second part of the definition is new and unique to what I researched on, which is that international prices in their currency of invoicing are not very sensitive to exchange rates at horizons of up to 2 years. Okay, so that's kind of a mouthful. But what it's basically saying is that most of the world, when it's selling in international markets, chooses the dollar as their currency in which they invoice. Now, if prices were completely flexible, it's completely irrelevant. What we mean by flexible is if you could change prices every second or even like every week, it didn't matter, then it's completely irrelevant if I said I was selling to you at a dollar price or at a yen price. Because, you know, I can sell it to you I can say, here's the dollar price, and if you say, well, I don't want the dollar price, tell me what the yen, give it to me at the yen price, I say, well, here's the exchange rate, I'm going to sell it to you at that yen price. So it's completely irrelevant. The only reason it becomes relevant if it is the case that this dollar price is fairly sticky or rigid, it doesn't change very much. And that's what the second part of that definition is, which says that this is indeed the case that that particular price doesn't change very much. It's not sensitive to exchange rates at horizons of up to 2 years. So what does that then imply? That implies that now there is an asymmetry in how countries are impacted from it. So think of the US. About 93% of US goods, of US imports, are invoiced in dollars. 93%. Okay? If that dollar price doesn't change very much every time the dollar is moving around relative to its trading partners, then the impact on US inflation is quite weak. It's going to be small, right? On the other hand, think of India. 98% of India's imports are invoiced in dollars. And that dollar price isn't changing very much, which means that whenever the rupee is depreciating or appreciating relative to its competitors, the price is, in rupees, is moving one-to-one with it. Right? So you have this asymmetry, which is that you have the US that's kind of insulated from its exchange rate movements, and you have India that's hugely exposed to its exchange rate movement. So there's nothing symmetric about one. The second is with regard to the terms of trade. And what it says is that, so in the previous world view, which is a view that prices are sticky in the producer's currency, you should expect that the terms of trade, which is the price of your exports over your price of your imports in the same currency, moves very closely with the exchange rate. So when the exchange rate depreciates, the terms of trade depreciates. When the exchange rate appreciates, the terms of trade appreciates. But here, when the whole world is setting prices in dollar terms, so this is obviously I'm taking it to the extreme, but it's a better extreme to be at than to be the one in which people are pricing in the producer's currency. If everybody is setting prices in dollars and those dollar prices aren't changing very much, your terms of trade is not moving around much at all, right? So think of Japan, and about 80% of Japanese exports to the US economy is priced in dollars, okay? And if it is the case that the yen appreciates or depreciates, the dollar price isn't changing that much, which means the demand, there's very little change in demand for Japanese products in the US market. So what you should expect to see is headlines that basically say that though the yen has depreciated by 20%, the quantity of their exports haven't gone up by that much. On the other hand, Japanese firms are making much bigger profits because their markups have gone up. Because the dollar price at which they're selling hasn't changed, their costs in dollars have fallen, so they're having a big increase in their markups. Okay, so that's the other implication of the international price system. So let me show you some evidence for it, and I'm going to show you three, I have four, in terms of roadmap, I have 4 points I want to go through. I'm going to illustrate the international price system using 3 countries, and you really can get the whole story from those 3 countries. Then I'll show you evidence for it with data from 35 countries. Then I'll show you evidence for the international price system using BLS's IPP data. And then I will conclude with the policy implications. So the empirical evidence for the IPS using BLS IPP data, really, if I were to go by the chronology of how this whole thing came about, that should be way up there. It should be number one. Because that's kind of how it started out. Then I was presenting to an audience where we had central bankers from 50 countries. I didn't want to make the US the center of the world. And so it's presented in the other order. Okay, so here's 3 countries. I picked 3 countries. The US, Japan, and Turkey. Okay? And what I have plotted over there is the concept of exchange rate pass-through. Okay, now there are many ways to measure it. And we don't need to go into the details of how one actually measures those things. But here's a simple exercise. A simple exercise you can think of is what's been graphed over there is, so if you look at, so there are 3 lines. There's the red line for the US, there's the green line for Japan, and there's the black solid line for Turkey. And each of those lines is basically graphing what happens to prices, import prices at the dock for each of these countries when their currency depreciates relative to their trading partners. So if you take the black line, it says that when the Turkish lira depreciates by 10% relative to its trading partners, then 1 month after that, import prices in Turkish lira go up by 9%. And if you go all the way up to 8 quarters, these are quarters. If you go 8 quarters later, which is 2 years out, it's about 10%, right? So a 10% depreciation of the Turkish lira relative to its trading partners raises import prices coming into of goods coming into Turkey in lira by 10%. So it's what we would call almost 100% pass-through, which is a 10% depreciation 2 years out raises lira prices by 10%. The green line is the same thing for Japan, and it says that on impact, when the Japanese yen depreciates relative to its trading partners by 10%, at the dock, import prices into Japan go up by 8%. Kind of stay around there, maybe move around a little bit, and maybe 8.5% or 9% at the end of 2 years. And then you have the US, where the impact effect of a 10% depreciation of the US dollar relative to its competitors is that it raises import prices coming into the US by around 3.5%, and then at the end it settles at about 4%. So there's 2 things that are striking about this picture. The first thing is the fact that there is this huge difference between the US and Turkey and Japan. Now, you might say, well, this is Japan. The yen is a reserve currency. It's a currency that everybody goes to in the middle of a panic. It's a developed economy, very high per capita income. So maybe it should be more like the US, that when people are selling to the Japanese market, they treat it like they're selling to the US market. That's how prices would, you would think that they would be more similar. I could think of an argument why, when they're selling to Turkey, they don't pay as much attention because it's a smaller market and they don't want to sell, they're priced differently. But when they're selling to Japan and the US, maybe it's the same. But that's actually not the case. Japan looks like Turkey, which is an emerging market. Japan looks like Argentina. If I plotted Argentina there, that's exactly where Argentina would look like Turkey. So for import prices coming into Japan, it looks like a developing economy. So why is that the case? And so that's the first difference. The second thing is that these lines are very flat. Right? There's not that much difference between the impact on prices 1 quarter after or the cumulative impact. So that's a cumulative impact, right? So the cumulative impact 8 quarters out or 2 years out is not very different from the impact effect immediately, which is basically saying that your knock-on inflation is going to be very soon. Right? You don't have an impact on inflation in the first quarter, maybe the second quarter, but then that's it. It's going to die away after that. So what explains this particular picture? Just mechanically, what it comes from the international price system, is the fact that In the case of Japan and Turkey, they overwhelmingly, their imports are not invoiced in their own currency, but they're invoiced in a foreign currency. In the case of Turkey, it's majority dollar, minority euro. In the case of Japan, it's entirely dollar. 76% of Japanese imports are priced in dollars. It's an interesting thing to ask about why is it that a country with such a well-respected currency would still be perfectly fine in a world where the dollar is being used. And I'll explain it. I will not leave you at the end of this talk saying that this is a complete, that this is a freak phenomenon, but I will rationalize it. So a lot of my papers are also in terms of rationalizing why is it that we live in this kind of world. And so that's what it is, which is, so with Japan importing 76% of its imports are priced in dollars, that dollar price doesn't change that much. So what that means is that when the Japanese yen depreciates or appreciates, you have close to a one-to-one pass-through into its prices. Similarly for Turkey. On the other hand, the US, only 7% of its imports are priced in a foreign currency, so the pass-through is much lower. So this is an example of what living in this world in the way prices get set would deliver for you in terms of the impact on prices. This is at the dock. This is not CPI. This is prices at the dock, import prices. Okay, so that's 3 countries. So the analysis goes forward and does it for 35 countries. Again, using aggregate import price indices. So to do that, what I went through is collect data for import prices. And it's actually pretty amazing how there are very few countries in the world that actually have well-constructed import and export price indices. So forget about the microdata that one can access. There is not even an aggregate price index that's well-constructed. And so at some level, I wasn't even sure that these things would line up as the theory would predict because of just how badly these things are constructed. The second thing I had to do was go around getting currency invoicing information. So for the US, I knew what the numbers was because I was working with BLS data. I know that number. This number is not publicly reported. It doesn't make headlines what currency invoicing shares are. So it's not readily available. You really have to go around contacting statistical agencies of different countries and ask them about their currency invoicing shares. And it's quite interesting actually when you're engaged in this kind of an exercise. You also learn about how different country governments and the statistical agencies work. And so so that was a fun learning experience too. As an example, when I contacted the Central Bank of Norway, that person said, okay, here's for what you're asking, it's going to cost you $200. You pay that and you get it. When I contacted the Central Bank of Argentina, they were like, it's going to cost you $50,000. And then they said, oh, but if you happen to know person X, you can get it for free. So I got it for free, but that was it tells you how different parts of the world work. So went around collecting this data, and so what I wanted was to do the same exercise as what the first figure does, but for 35 countries. Okay, so the first piece of the IPS definition, which is the dominance of dollar invoicing in world trade. You must have heard about how the dollar's role in asset markets in the world. That's like a big thing. Everybody talks about it all the time. Monetary policy spillovers through the asset channel. That's a big deal. If you look at what's the amount of dollar used in asset trade in the world outside of transactions involving U.S. citizens, the number is about, say, 12%. Okay. The dollar invoicing in world trade is an order of magnitude bigger than that. It's much more used in trade with across third parties. So let's look at the graph that says imports, trade versus currency share. So it's a very simple graph. What it basically has, the first column of that particular graph has the black portion basically tells you the share of world imports, that is US imports. the kind of the whitish part is part of the column is the share that's imports by the EU, and the rest of it, the kind of the dark gray, is the share by everybody else. So it all adds up to 1. The column that says invoicing does the same thing, but it tells you what's the fraction of world imports that gets invoiced in dollars. The segment above that is what gets invoiced in euros, and the segment above that is what gets invoiced in any other currency. And then the next part of the graph, the next set of columns is for exports. So the first thing that you see is that invoicing is either in the dollar or in the euro. I mean, in the world, it's not third currencies are not being used that much. But what you also see is that the dollar share in invoicing is many times a multiple of its share in world trade, right? So dollar invoicing share is about 4.7 times its share in world imports, about 3.1 times its share in world exports. So it's basically saying that there are numerous trade transactions that happen in the world that have nothing to do with the US, but the invoicing gets done in dollars. So there is an Indian company trading with a Korean firm, and they're all invoicing in dollars, and there is no U.S. counterparty to it. This is all the U.S., all dollar based. The euro, on the other hand, I mean, the reason that the euro shows up as having such a large invoicing share is basically because these are countries in the EU that are using the euro, which is their own currency. So it's not as if this is that much off compared to their share in world trade. It's only 1.2 times the share in world trade. So despite the euro being around since 1999. The dollar continues to be the dominant currency in world trade. So let me give you some examples here. So here's in this table what you have is the fraction of your trade with the rest of the world that's invoiced in your own currency, right? So for the US, 93% of its imports are invoiced in dollars. 97% of its exports are invoiced in dollars. But very, very quickly, you'll see that this ratio falls to, again, single digits or even very low double digits. So let's look at the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom, or let's even look at Germany. Germany, only 55% of Germany's imports are priced in euros, and 62% of its exports are priced in euros. If you go to the United Kingdom, 32% of its imports are priced in the British pound. 51% is priced in the case of exports, it's 51%. You go to Australia, 31% of its imports are priced in its own currency. Switzerland, which is another country with a very strong currency, the Swiss franc, 31% of it is priced in Swiss franc, and those are the other currencies that they use. Japan, 23% of its imports are priced in the Japanese yen. And so, very quickly, Canada, 20%. So, the US is really quite the exception by far in how much of its own currency is being used in world markets. This is not a world where you have producer currency pricing. This is a world where you have dollar pricing across the board. Okay. And if you look at the share of dollar invoicing in world trade relative to the GDP per capita, which is on the x-axis, it's basically saying, so if you take the euro countries out, which you really should, so if you look at the right graph, you see that there's a big hole over there. You see the US is at the bottom with having very little foreign currency invoicing, and everybody else is up there using a whole lot of dollar invoicing. Okay, the second thing is that there's a lot of stability in these invoicing patterns over time. There's not as if the case that these patterns change much over the time. They're very, very stable. Okay, so let me show you some more graphs which re-emphasize the picture I showed you with the three countries. So the picture that I showed you with the three countries basically said that there's not much difference between the cumulative pass-through 2 years out and the pass-through in the first quarter, right? In the first 2 quarters. So what I'm going to show you is a graph which does that for 35 countries. For 35 countries, I know the cumulative pass-through 8 quarters out, and I know the cumulative pass-through the first quarter. And if it is the case that it is like my very first figure, then it must be that these things line up very much on a 45 degrees line. The countries that have very high long-run pass-through are also those that have very high short-run pass-through. There's not much difference in the pass-through between the short and the long run. So it should be around a 45 degree line, and that's kind of what it is. The slope is about 0.9, the intercept is 0. It is the case that countries that those lines that I showed you in the beginning are very flat for a country over time is true more generally for countries. So you could see that for different measures, 8 quarters relative to 1 quarter. So what I'm graphing here is the different pass-throughs across different horizons, the 4 quarter against the 1 quarter, 8 quarter against the 1 quarter, and so on. The second piece of the thing was that countries with higher share of imports invoiced in a foreign currency have both higher short-run and long-run pass-through. And that's what you see here. You see that there's a positively sloped relationship between countries that invoice heavily in a foreign currency and countries that have and their pass-through rates. And you can see that for 4 quarters, for 8 quarters, it's a common phenomenon. So I want to show you a few figures for the US economy, which for me are the most striking. So there are many, if that was all the data that I had, if that was my, what I had, the only evidence that I had, I would have been a little skeptical about pushing this thing so hard. The reasons for that are many. One is that a lot of these import and export price indices, like I said, in most countries in the world, are very poorly constructed. The second thing is that we know a lot of trade in the world takes place intra-firm. Right? You have transfer prices, right? And who the hell knows what transfer prices are? They're completely not allocated. They could be anything. People, this is an internal firm price, the price at which they're selling to themselves. It could be anything, in which case it's kind of meaningless. I can't infer that much from. The other thing is that I really want to be able to condition on a price change, which is the fact that that it's not just, I want to make this statement that it's not just that, that for 6 months the dollar price is completely sticky and it's not changing and that's what this is all about. But I want to say that even when firms do change their price, they respond very little to the exchange rate. At least I have to verify that. And this is where the IPP data was absolutely crucial. Because the IPP data with all this level of detail, which told me whether these transactions were intra-firm, the fact that I could observe the price, I could observe the moment when the price changes. So even if you're concerned about, say, reporting issues and the fact that prices, maybe they stick here longer than they really are because of some reporting, which I'm sure is not the case, but you might want to condition on a price change, so at least you can have a lot of faith in that. So it's because I did this, I was comfortable going with everything else I saw, you saw in the overall country study. And this is a really interesting picture because it's basically the graph. This is like my 3-country graph, but for the U.S. And what I've graphed here is I took the import price index for the U.S., non-commodities only, non-petroleum to be specific. I broke those up into goods that were invoiced in dollars and goods that were invoiced in non-dollars or in a foreign currency. And I estimated the pass-through into dollar prices of the goods that are priced in dollars versus the goods that are priced in a foreign currency, in non-dollars. And as you can see, this looks exactly like Turkey versus the US. So for goods that are coming into the US that are priced not in dollars, the pass-through is basically 100%. Right? For the goods coming into the US that are priced in dollars, the pass-through is very low. So the only reason that the US ends up having low average pass-through is because you're putting all of that weight on that black line. Because 93% of US imports are priced in dollars, and so you're putting all of the weight on that line, and so you end up with a figure. But otherwise, the US, for goods that are not priced in dollars, it looks the same as everybody else. And then when you do condition on a price change, which is that again, I break the sample up between goods priced in dollars and non-dollars, and I see that even when the dollar price is changed, the pass-through for goods priced in dollars is 26%, the pass-through for goods priced in non-dollars is 85%. So there's a big gap in that pass-through, even when prices actually do change, and you can go and do many, many, many cuts of this, and you can see You can do this country by country, you can do this within 10-digit HS codes, and it's the same thing, that there is a big difference between the two. So this is not just about the fact that firms forgot to change prices, but it's the case that even when they do, they don't really respond much to the exchange rate. That's lifelong pass-through, which is, or the life of the good in the BLS sample, and again, there's a big difference between dollar goods and non-dollar goods. Okay, before I go on to the policy implications of this, I want to just tell you a little bit about why this is what we should expect to see in the world, right? So think about it. Think about a firm that's choosing to set prices in the world market, okay? So a firm that's just choosing to price in dollars says, okay, I'm going to tell you, go to a Japanese firm, I'm selling to the US market. We have to decide on whether we sell at a dollar price, we set a dollar price in the contract or a yen price in the contract. And the reason we need to decide that is because the dollar price and the yen price is not going to change for some period of time. And we know that the exchange rate is going to move around, so one of us is going to bear the risk of the exchange rate moving. So the question is, what's at the dollar pricing? What currency do I choose? What the theory would say is that the Japanese firm should set a price, should choose whichever currency in which its so-called desired price, or its first best price, is very stable. So what does that mean? What that means is that what matters for my pricing? What matters for my pricing is my costs, and the other thing that matters for my pricing is who I compete with in the different markets, right? Because there's a lot of competition. I don't want my price to be too high relative to my competitors. I'd like it to be very similar and relatively stable relative to my competitors, and that matters. So now, we are in this world, if we live in this world where the dollar is used very heavily, then that reinforces my desire to choose the dollar as a currency to price in. Why? Because the Japanese firm, a big part, most exporters are also importers, right? So most people who are exporting in the world are also importing. I'm importing products or intermediate inputs that I use to produce this good that I'm going to sell on the world market. I'm paying for those intermediate inputs in terms of dollar pricing, which means it's easier if I keep my product price more in line with in dollar terms too, because then it's going to be more in line with what my costs are. The second thing is that I'm selling in a market where everybody else is choosing to price in dollars. I don't want my price to move around a lot. So there's going to be a period of time when I don't change prices. When, if I chose to price in yen, then the dollar price is going to move around a lot in the period when I don't change the price. And I don't want to do that because then I lose market share relative to my competitors. So that again reinforces my desire to price in dollars. So for both those reasons, we are in what they call a multiple equilibrium world, which is a world where if it so happens that everybody's pricing in dollars, there's a good reason why the next exporter also wants to use the dollar as a currency to invoice. Right? There's nothing special about the dollar here. If for some reason tomorrow everybody woke up and there was a massive World Trade Conference that said that let's all now price in euros, then we could switch to the other case where everybody is now pricing in euros, and now the US is like Turkey, and the euro area is like the US. Right? So there's nothing special about the USA, but we just happen to be in this equilibrium where people use this currency. Now, of course, you can make an argument why the dollar would stay for a very long time, because a lot of trade financing also gets done in dollars. And so there is a linkage to the finance world where the dollar also gets used a lot. And so there is another reason why companies would choose to use the dollar. And of course, not to take away credit from the US Central Bank, the dollar is a good currency to hold. I don't see the Argentinian peso anytime soon taking over the dollar. You will never ever have that equilibrium where people will agree on that. But an argument could be asked, but why is it not the euro? Why is it not the yen? I think that was a perfectly reasonable point. Okay. All right, so policy implications. So the first thing is about for inflation. Now, the Feds, Janet Yellen, they care about not prices at the dock, they care about prices in the consumer price index. Right? They care about inflation into the CPI. So there are many ways to look at the impact of the exchange rate on inflation to CPI, but I did something very simple because I am skeptical about some of these other approaches. What I did was take a measure of the import content of the consumer bundle, and then just multiply it with my pass-through estimate. Okay, that's on the assumption that all intermediate purchasers of this goods, which is any company that's importing a particular good, I get it at a particular dollar price, and I literally just sell it at that dollar price of the world, or I have a constant markup. I don't change the markup at which I sell it to the final consumers. So what I mean is that there's 100% pass through from the retailer to the consumer. So if I do that construction, and this is what it says. It says, following a 10% depreciation, the US, whose consumer bundle has an import content of about 12%, the impact on CPI inflation, cumulative CPI inflation, 8 quarters out, is between 0.4 and 0.7 percentage points. Okay? Stan Fisher, who was also at the Jackson Hole Symposium, presented his views on the effect of the dollar on U.S. inflation, and he was using what's called the FRBIS model, which is the FRB US model that they have, which has a gazillion equations in there, and his number came out to be 0.5, so I was glad. It was in the middle of this range. Though, in my opinion, I really do think this is an upper bound, that even 0.4 to 0.7 is really on the high end of it for many reasons I'm not going to get into now. But that's like as much as it gets. But on the other hand, if you go down to Turkey, a 10% depreciation of the Turkish lira, the impact effect, the pressure on CPI inflation is 4 times as big as it is on the US economy. So it's about 1.65 to 2 percentage points. So it's not so much that the import content is that different across these different countries, but it is the fact that import pass-through is very different across these different countries. So I had made this statement which got a lot of attention, which said that because at that time, we still didn't have the first rate hike, and there were a lot of statements from the Feds that were saying that because of the dollar appreciating, there was a concern, a disinflationary concern for the U.S. So I said basically it's unlikely to be a major disinflationary concern for the U.S. There are 2 things. One, the numbers, I understand that compared to 0, every number is big, but we are really talking about close to 0 numbers. The second thing is that these effects are very short term. From how flat the line was, most of it should have been passed through already. It's not going to show up in inflation for very long. On the other hand, the appreciation is a much more significant inflationary concern for other countries like Turkey. The second thing is there's going to be asymmetries in monetary policy spillover. So what does that mean? What that means is that let's think of it in the following way. Suppose that there is a concern that the U.S. economy is overheating, is showing up in inflation, and so the Fed responds by raising interest rates. When it raises interest rates, an outcome of what will fall out of that is that there is a switch in demand towards U.S. assets away from foreign assets because U.S. assets are paying more now. That's going to cause the dollar to appreciate. When the dollar appreciates, that by construction means that everybody else's currency depreciates relative to the dollar. That's by construction. So when everybody else's currency depreciates relative to the dollar, and they live in this international price system, there's going to be a lot of pressure on their inflation. If that's going to put pressure on their inflation, it's going to make them also want to raise their interest rate. So there is this positive spillover where an interest rate hike in the US puts pressure on the rest of the world also to raise interest rates. The flip side doesn't happen because when the rest of the world raises interest rates, even if their currency appreciates relative to the dollar, we just saw that the U.S. inflation is really quite a whole lot more insulated relative to the rest of the world, and so there's really not that much pressure on the U.S. Fed to raise interest rates. The next policy implication is about export competitiveness, quantities versus markups. As I said at the beginning, the consensus view is that when your currency depreciates, it's going to be good for you. You're going to be able to sell more on the market. Your export quantities are going to go up. But that's not the case. For the U.S., it's true. It also, just to be clear, it's also symmetrically on the downside when the currency appreciates. So when the dollar appreciates, they do sell less on the world markets. But for most of the other countries in the world, the dollar price is not changing much, the demand is not changing that much, and most of it is showing up in the form of markup. The third is these discussions about the internationalization of currencies. So the Chinese government is making a big push to make the yuan being used heavily in its trade with other countries. They're trying to persuade people to use that. They have other reasons for doing so, but one could make an argument that if indeed they're able to get more of their trading partners to do so, they would get some more inflation insulation. And then the fourth is what I said earlier, which is that there is nothing special about the dollar being the currency of voicing world trade. So suppose, again, that you could end up with, suppose all these traders in the world got together and said, let's use the IMF's SDR, which is a unit of account that the IMF has. The SDR is basically, it's really literally just a unit of account of the International Monetary Fund, and it's a basket of currencies, a basket of reserve currency. And as you know, the Chinese yuan just sneaked into the bundle, like 1% share or something like that. So if everybody said, okay, we're going to write our contracts not in terms of dollars, but in terms of the SDR, that will certainly bring more symmetry to the world, as opposed to if it was just price in dollars. Now, I'm not saying that they will do this because there are lots, like I told you, there are a lot of reasons why firms like to use the dollar as their currency of invoicing, so it will have to be privately optimal to do that. But the reason I want to flag this is that people have talked about the SDR as being another reserve currency, saying that, okay, maybe we should have the SDR as a reserve currency. That's a crazy idea because there is no additional fiscal backing that the IMF has besides what the US government and the other reserve currency members have. So that's just dead on arrival. But what is true is that if you think in terms of goods trade, having the SDR as a unit of account is certainly a much more viable possibility. Anyway, I'm out of time, but I'm going to stop. And again, I just want to end by saying that this is obviously not the end of this research agenda. There's more to be done, and I hope to keep coming back here and learning more. There are many things that I do in the Jackson Hole paper, which is a bit of speculation towards the end, where I speculated this is how things would happen, that I'd like to verify and hope that other researchers also do so. But again, I just want to thank everybody at the BLS for the incredible support that's gotten in working on this particular research agenda of mine. And it's had an impact. After this particular symposium, I was contacted by central bankers from many parts of the world, also a lot of hedge fund managers who figured there might be a way to make money out of this. But there is a lot of keen interest in understanding this. There's not a day that goes without a headline that's about some country engaging in currency manipulation and impact on prices and impact on world trade. So I think this is a hugely important topic, and the data that you're collecting here is hugely valuable for our understanding of how the world works. Questions at all?
Yeah, so if anyone has any questions, myself and Barca on the left side have microphones. If you want to make sure to speak into the microphone, make sure you hit the push button, make sure it's green so anyone streaming can hear you. But yeah, if you have any questions.
Hello?
It's pushing this here.
Yeah, it should be
Hello.
on.
Well, I think I can speak loud.
Well, we're trying to get streaming people from
Oh,
in
I
the
see,
field
okay.
office, so see if you can get it.
You can also repeat your question.
Hello, hello.
Let's see if that mic works. I think they might be turned off.
Okay.
If you could repeat the question whenever it's asked, so
Yeah.
people streaming could hear it.
Okay. I just thank you very much for the presentation.
Why don't you stand up?
Yes. Okay. My name is Esteban Balseca. I work in the International Price Program, and I was just wondering. I had two quick questions. I was wondering if to include more of the world in a formulation of the international price system. Shouldn't we also, or couldn't we also take into account how open countries are? How much trade actually represents to their economy. Because in your paper you say that the amount of imports priced in foreign currency is a good proxy. But even if it's 100% and imports represents nothing to their economy or very little to their economy, it seems like that would be a more global way to indicate. So I was wondering that. And then my second question is if you believe that a policy implication of your research is that the rest of the world should move towards pegging their currency to the dollar.
Great, both great questions. So the first question was about the fact that how much, the extent to which we should care about the relationship between import prices at the dock and exchange rates also depends upon how big a deal imports are for the country as a whole. And the second was, does this in any way suggest that countries should move towards a peg? So the first, you're absolutely right, that there is a, just by construction, if it's a very tiny portion of your consumption bundle, then the consequences for you is going to be small. But I think what we should keep in mind is that even for the US, the candidate that's usually put out there as being quite important for inflation is the US output gap. However measured in terms of the relationship between the size of the unemployment rate relative to the long-run unemployment rate or output relative to potential output. For most econometric studies, the impact of that in US inflation is becoming diminishingly small. So in fact, the exchange rate shows up as being probably as important, or maybe sometimes even a little more important than the output gap is for the US economy. So, while it is true that it is a small, imports make up a small fraction of the US consumption bundle ultimately, it's really not that less important than the output gap is when you're estimating those relationships. So that's an important point to keep in mind. The second thing is about pegs. The way I would answer that question is to say that in the conventional view of the world, what I stated at the beginning, coming from Mandel and Fleming, that would push you towards saying it's very important to have floating exchange rates. Okay? This international price system says that the benefits to having a floating exchange rate might be not as big as you think. Right? Now, there are many costs to having a fixed exchange rate. And there is certainly still some benefit here because while your export prices, like I said, your exports and import prices are both set in dollars, which means that the dollar export price doesn't change, but then when my currency depreciates, it's going to make my import prices in my own currency more expensive. So you still have some of that expenditure switching channel, which is valuable. Not as big as you would expect by the conventional wisdom, so there is still a reason not to go towards a peg. The other thing is, of course, there are many other costs to having a pegged exchange rate, which they tend to be very disruptive to usually pegs end in collapses. But you're right in terms of the basic direction, which is that it does move you away from saying that the benefits of having a floating exchange rate are so big that countries should really not be manipulating their currencies.
So I believe we have the microphone working. So if anyone else has any other questions, one second.
First, I want to say, there's someone outside the price programs. I work in employment and unemployment. This is actually really fascinating. I really love this. So I had a question for you. So my takeaway from this is that there are some countries that are more impacted by inflation than others. And I was wondering, for those countries that might price most of their goods in dollars, are there effects of the labor force based upon this? And if so, what is that effect?
Yes. So once you establish these transmission effects, you would have whatever would be the standard channels through which labor markets get affected. So the fact, again, maybe go back to India, the fact that Indian exporters price in dollars would mean that if the dollar depreciates, the impact in terms of hiring more workers because the demand for their products have gone up is not such a big deal anymore. Because those dollar prices aren't changing that much, which means that the demand from the rest of the world is not changing that much. And so compared to the conventional wisdom, which would be that this would be very stimulative for the export sector in terms of the amount that they sell, and so they're going to produce more, they're going to hire more, that would be much more dampened in this environment. And you see this references to that in the press when people talk about Japan, which is having this major yen depreciation, that you do see that they say that it's not like they're hiring, the export sector is hiring more workers. You don't see wages in the export sector by all these workers going up. All that you see is that these stock prices of these firms are going up because they're making bigger profits. Because the dollar, the dollar price isn't changing. If they're selling, the yen costs is sticky, which means that the dollar costs are going down. So then they're making bigger profits, markups. So so on the export side, the demand increase and therefore the effect on labor is much more muted. On the import side, you have a stronger expenditure switching effect, which comes because imports from the rest of the world have become far more expensive, so there might be a shift towards domestic production. But that's much harder to bring around because a lot of the things that you import are not stuff that you produce very easily, and so the I guess employment boost that you get from having a weaker currency might not be that big.
All right, I think due to time, we're going to take maybe one or two more questions. Does anyone else have anything?
Great. Okay, so I'll just ask a quick question. We focused implicitly more on imports and exports of goods than of services. How would you contrast what's going on in services to what's going on in goods?
Thank you. Indeed, it is a great question. Indeed, it is the case that service trade has become more important. I think the only reason that we know less about it is because we have less data on services. In general, services are always nasty to measure: prices, productivity, all of those things. But if there is data available, I'd be thrilled to work on it. But I think you're right that as a world, as services is becoming an important part of world trade, for a full picture, you really want to understand that too.
So I believe we had one more question here.
To what extent do you think the patterns you've shown here explain a lot of inequality increases, particularly in developing countries? And to what extent might that have something to do with the discussion of the savings glut?
I wouldn't necessarily say that this is first order to understanding the increase in inequality within countries over time. At least what I've presented. What is true is, on the other hand, is that if you want to use the word inequality, is more in terms of what I said, which is these asymmetries in spillovers of monetary policy across countries. So it's a different kind of, I don't know whether we want to use the word inequality here, but it's definitely the case that the US has much more of an impact. Its policy choices has a much more of an impact on the rest of the world than the rest of the world does have in the US. So when developing country central bankers say that US monetary authority should maybe take into account what's happening to the rest of the world when they set their monetary policy because of these spillover effects, they're right. But what the international price system also says is that there's really very little in the US's interest to care about the rest of the world at this point. Because while it's true that the US policy, that there is something that the US can do that's good for the rest of the world, in this extreme case, there's very little the rest of the world can do that's good for the US economy. So usually, whenever you get into arrangements like this, everybody wins at some point in time. But if you don't, there's not that much in the current system that we function with.
All right, I think if everyone give one more round of applause for our distinguished guests.
Thanks to everyone. In appreciation, thanks especially to, okay.
Those people who don't know me. This is
I'm Susan
Fleck.
Fleck. I'm the Assistant Commissioner for International Prices. And I was touched also by your mention of Bill Alterman, given his, in his role in the program. So what I wanted to do to wrap up, Dr. Gopinath, I want to thank you very much. I want to thank all of the IPP staff who worked in coordinating this. Special thanks to Rosie for her work in supporting you in the work you've done. And I want to also thank the research staff, which has now developed an IPP research database using the data that we initially provided to you so that we can provide that to more researchers. I have a memento of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, thanks to the combined federal campaign. We have a BLS mug and a BLS t-shirt for you. So please wear them around the Harvard campus and tell everybody how great we are. Thanks very much.
Before you all leave, please fill out the cards as you leave. The marketing committee would like those feedback. Thank you.